Okay. 8 July 2025, dis&datInformation. Welcome. We're on lecture number 7 for Anwar Sheikh. Going to move a little further along for Marx. I think you'll note that for the next couple of days that I'm going to be talking sort of in the background of this. And so while he's talking about value, use, value, and price, I'm going to talk about the problem of form or value form, because I think there's a general misreading of it, with all due respect, since the invocation by people like Heinrich on the issue of what counts as form. So I'll be occasionally yammering about that, about the issue of form. Talking a little bit about the family resemblance among formalisms at the turn of the century, that is between the 19th and the 20th century. And yes, it may appear a little too humanist or literary, but in fact, if there is in fact a science of criticism, there can also be a criticism of science. And I think that's kind of what's going on with Sheikh's presentation. Not that that's a bad thing. But on today's little page, there will be a somewhat extensive introduction to something I've mentioned before, and that is John Milios's article on Marx's value theory revisited. That is the so-called value form approach. And so I'll be yammering a bit about that, about the problem of abstraction, and then I'll move to an actual review by Heikki Patamaki of Sheikh's book, the book that he refers to in his lecture when, he said, well, my book is coming out. Well, it takes a little while to get these things out there, but it is a kind of magnum opus. And it is his book, Sheikh's book, Capitalism, Competition, Conflict, and Crisis. Now, in reading this review of the book, you'll see that the review itself has its own problematic, and I won't go into that now, but it's worth considering. Partially, it's one of the reasons why I don't like reviewing books, because you never can do it justice, and you wind up kind of synopsizing in the wrong way, or often pushing a button that you don't need to push in terms of criticism, and without getting into a thing. And then I've included what I think you'll find interesting is a little article that introduces all the integration of these matters that are discussed by Sheikh, and that is why capitalism fails, Marxist crisis theories. It is about crisis theory, but it is essentially about some of the issues of competition under radical theories, underconsumption, profit squeeze, and the falling rate of profit. And lest you think that that's unimportant, it is the crux of, sectarian difference among, Marxist discussions, discourse. And often the limit is, of course, your tolerance of other people's obsessions or whatever. So anyway, we're going to go now to the Anwar Sheikh lecture, and that'll come up in a second or so. And enjoy, as Trump says on his postings.
This course is part of a longer project of mine, which is to show that there is an alternate foundation for economics, different from neoclassical economics and different from Keynesian, post-Keynesian economics, but one that can answer and has to address the same questions. So my book, which is hopefully going to be coming out from Oxford University Press, I've sent it to them, and we're about to sort of finalize that stage, is the summary of the work that I have been doing for, depending on how you look at it, for a minimum of 14 years and a maximum of 30 years. That's what I call a Piero-Sraffa range. So, and the reason is that over time, my first task was to try to understand what the classical tradition was, and that took time. I was fortunate I could teach here, I could teach graduate students. In those days, we had many more courses on this kind of subject. We had at least 5. Now we're down to 1. And as my ideas developed, I began to realize that I needed to address them empirically, and I needed to address topics that were not listed. You know, Ricardo doesn't say anything about effective demand except say. Marx says schemes of reproduction, but he doesn't talk about effective demand. Keynes doesn't talk about the classical tradition. So to integrate this into a framework, I had to develop answers to questions which had not been developed before. And as those answers accumulated, I basically filled out in my head a map of the structure and questions and answers, and that can go on forever, but at some point it became visible to me that I could start to put this together. And I started putting it together in 1997 and continued working on that in bits and pieces and basically finished it this July. The goal is, as I said, to address the same issues, but unlike most books of this sort, it is not about alternate theories. It's about capitalism. And all the theories are assessed in terms of their relation to real processes. At this present stage, it's aimed at the analysis of developed capitalism because that's a prelude or foundation for the analysis of development itself, which has many specific, more concrete factors. And like all such works, it's a never-ending work. But at least I'm satisfied that I've done the best I can. I can say that it is a long book. It has a lot of material in it, a lot of derivations, and you are seeing an effect, maybe 20% of that in this course. Because we don't do a lot of empirical work, I don't do the mathematical derivations, but also there are many subjects I don't cover. The book begins with an analysis of how capitalism functions, the empirical evidence, and I'm particularly interested in long-term patterns because I want to emphasize to people that these are turbulent, dynamic patterns and kind of evolutionary patterns. And then I want to ask, how do you address that theoretically? And that raises the question of micro-foundations. How can you analyze a system without relying on optimizing and rational choice, which I undertake a critique and argue that it's basically an ideological device. And we're going to end today with exactly that point. And then I develop from there the theory of production, the theory of profit, each case relating it to empirical evidence also, but to the other 2 schools in the literature, neoclassical theory, Keynesian or post-Keynesian theory. So every chapter has those 3 components, the basic development of what might be called the classical argument, the neoclassical and Keynesian alternative, and a discussion of that in the empirical evidence. And the chapters go through production, profit, money, long, and in my view, a beautiful chapter on money, which I love, but apparently some reviewers didn't, because they think the money is not relevant. I think it's very relevant. So I go back to the history of money, to origins of money, because people think that money was invented by the state or invented by, minimizing cost. In the real history of money is much more interesting than that. I have wonderful pictures of forms of money like flying fox jaws, which were a form of money. As we know, also tobacco in the United States was a form of money, salt and so on, hides. And then from money, I go into exchange, and exchange leads to the theory of relative price, the discussion of Ricardo and Smith and Marx and the transformation and all that is there. But the issue is not to settle those questions per se, but to show that there's a framework in which they can be addressed and actually resolved. Empirical evidence on that, theory of what comes after price, theory of relative prices, theories of competition, what I call real competition as opposed to perfect, imperfect competition, which I consider a kind of tribal affair. Both sides are referring back to the same thing, and I will argue that real competition is utterly different than perfect competition and existed before it, but it is in fact dynamically better, able to relate to business concerns and business practices and empirical evidence, lots of empirical evidence. Then industrial prices, time, labor times, and structure of production, what we talked about last time, capital labor ratios. What's the evidence? What's the empirical evidence? Then the theory of interest, finance, stock market, stock prices, bond prices, interest rates, empirical evidence, how it compares to the two different theories. Then the theory of international trade, we touched on that with Ricardo. And the implications for trade between unequal nations, and the empirical evidence, and the other two theories and a critique of them. So that covers part one is foundations, methodology, micro foundations, how to do measurement when your categories are different from standard ones, the empirical results of measuring for profits and all that. Part two is the part I just talked about, beginning from the theory of competition to exchange rates and trade, including finance capital and its implications. And then part three is macro. History of macro, beginning from Keynes, though one can go back earlier, and the rise and fall of Keynesian economics, the replacement by orthodox economics, Friedman, and I'm going to do some of that in this class if I get time to do it, Friedman and Phelps and rational expectations, Nehru and all of that, then post-Keynesian economics and its way of treating the same issues, effective demand, then begins a section called macro, the equivalent, grounded in the classical competitive notion. And from there, the development of wages and productivity and the relation of that to the balance of power between capital and labor. I have some really amazing evidence about the United States on the where the Phillips curve is really, and then a chapter on the theory of unemployment. Classical theory of, neoclassical theory, full employment, Keynesian theory, employment is possible. The classical argument coming from Marx that the unemployment is necessary because it's reproduced by the workings of the mechanism. Again, empirical evidence, two different approaches, and then the whole thing wraps up in the theory of cycles, long cycles, and the crisis. So we end up where we started in the present. And as you can see along the way, long time to solve certain problems. What's an appropriate foundation for the theory of effective demand in a classical tradition? How do you measure capital stock? It took me 10 years. What about the theory of interest rates? So I solved these problems one at a time, and as I solved them, I saw another problem. And so as a map filled out, I realized I had enough. I've left out of it the theory of inequality, which is something I'm very interested in, but it's just too much. Theory of stock flow accounting, again, very interesting issue and tightly related to Walras's law and all that. It's too much. I don't know if they're going to accept this book as it stands because it's big. On the other hand, if I don't do it that way, people will think it's just a series of opinions and topics. And I want to do exactly what we're reading now in Smith and Ricardo, a coherent argument, at least lay it out. It may not be accepted, it may not be right, but it should be said that it's derived from the same principles. And nowhere do I need to refer to optimality or maximizing in order to talk about micro behavior or macro behavior. While I've got you on this subject, as you know, Noe and I announced at the party that we're going to do a project. We're probably looking for students at a more advanced level than you, but anyway, just to mention it, that we want to do a project called Rethinking Micro. And that is to take this idea that you can derive all the essential propositions, empirically observed propositions, of microeconomics without any reference to maximizing utility or any other such device. Because there are other ways to deal with aggregates that don't require any of that. And we do the empirical evidence, actually. And we're going to start, in effect, a study group of people who have the sufficient background, who've already had advanced micro, and have some experience with that part of the work. So this is an ongoing project. I hope it'll continue. And the basic idea is to convince people that they don't need to be stuck in this perfect-imperfect competition framework, which seems to not only dominate micro, but dominates macro today. And it's possible to do it without that. I can say that what Marx once said about his first publication, which was called A Contribution to Critique of Political Economy, it turned out to be decisively non-popular, so much so that his contract was canceled. So I'm hoping that Oxford will not come to that point, but if this succeeds in about a year from now, 9 months from now, before the term is over, I should have a book party to which you'll all be invited. It'll be expensive, so I'm not suggesting you buy the book, but anyway, you can look at it. Okay. But I will sign it if you buy it. I won't sign the PDF version that you scanned in. So. Okay. So many things I say here are actually elaborated in the book, and I can only refer to them because we don't have the time. Okay. So what we're going to be talking about today is the formal presentation in, I'm sorry, now let me back up. Let me just say where we ended last time. last time I spent quite a bit of time on the stages of Marx's work. And there for two reasons. So it's interesting in itself, but I wanted to make a crucial point that Marx's work had a character of development, so that we cannot say that Marx was born with capital in his head when he was a baby and just spoke it like Jesus and the words were true. He had to come to that. He changed his mind over time. He even rejected some of his own starting points. And so we have to see it as the development of any science, the development of ideas. And so you should approach it that way. And that is a different way than, unfortunately, it got approached in the Marxist literature. Either rejected because it was no longer applicable because now we have monopoly capitalism, and that means they rejected because they didn't really understand how the theory of competition works, or it was taken to be kind of gospel. Dennis Melnick gave a talk last week, if you remember. I don't know how many of you came to the department seminar, and he talked about how in the Soviet Union, when he was growing up, and even later, the debates about Marx took on a kind of theological character. And that's not uncommon in many parts of the world. I think Marx is worth too much to be treated as a divine character. It has to be treated scientifically and critically. And so I hope to try to do that as we go along. So if you understand the stage of developments, then a second problem arises, which is that in addition to his ideas developing, he never finished publishing. He never wrote a book that would put together his final thoughts. And so what we have is what Engels put together after Volume 1. And there's considerable issues about whether Engels did it correctly. Not because of anything else, but Engels himself was old, going blind, near the end of his life, and he took on this task for his best friend and comrade to put together the work that Marx himself never put together. And there is an infinite amount of excavation to be done as the unpublished manuscripts become available, if they become available over time. But the non-completion of Marx's work raises a problem. And the problem is relevant to what we're going to be starting today, which is that since the work is not complete, we have this difficulty of not knowing when Marx is setting up an issue which he means to resolve in a different way. Though sometimes he tells us. But mostly he doesn't, because he has a peculiar style, not necessarily a bad style, of refusing to bring in issues until all of the foundation has been adequately developed. And that comes from his own method of presentation, which is not, as he puts it, the method of derivation, but the method by which the argument should be logically presented. For that reason, he makes assumptions that he does not elaborate, but he says will be addressed later. And there is, alas, the later that we get only from Engels' compilation. And even there, many of the key issues are not related back to Volume 1, because of course he didn't put them together. Otherwise he would have. If he'd done that, he would have said, as I said in Volume 1 and Volume 2, but he doesn't say that. He's just writing the material itself. And in fact, much of the time when he's writing that material, Volume 1 hadn't been written, because Volume 1 is, of course, written at the end, near the end of his life. So we have to then ask ourselves, can we take words and phrases to mean the proper content of what he intended to do? And I'm going to read some of these things fairly carefully, but I'm going to read them from the point of view of the logic of his argument. That's, to me, the crucial criterion. Because we don't have any other basis, we have to say, well, given this logic, how would it be extended? And I think that's the appropriate way. If you were doing Newton before he finished the theory of gravity, then you'd have this question, why does the moon not fall down? And from the logic of this argument, we have to see if either it contradicts it, because the moon doesn't fall down, or is it possible to show that gravity, when extended to more concrete circumstances, gives you orbits? And that's the proper way, either way. What I want to caution against is the argument that is the notion that either the abstract argument is sufficient, because after all Marx said it, which is what I call the dogmatic side, or the abstract argument is all wrong because the moon doesn't fall down to the earth, so it's obviously that gravity is not a relevant phenomenon, which I call the eclectic side. And there's, in the history of debates about Marx, both sides are present. People take different sides. They find a phenomena that seems to contradict the abstract level, and they say, well, see, capitalism has changed. This is very tempting for academics, because there's nothing better to give you credit for in history than to identify that capitalism has changed, even if it hasn't changed, because at least your name gets circulated around with this new epoch attached to it, so to speak, for a while anyway. So I want to caution against that, to take it more carefully. And to do that, it's important, therefore, to read the text in front of you with some sense of the intent of it. Not just the words, but where it comes from. I paid some attention to the theory of value in Ricardo and Smith, the theory of surplus product in Ricardo and Smith, because you're going to see that Marx refers to this, but in a way that you wouldn't understand if you hadn't read Smith and Ricardo, knowing what these ideas are going to reappear again and again. Okay. So here is typical of Marx. He's going to start talking about capitalism, and he starts off by saying that capitalism presents itself as an immense accumulation of commodities. This is virtually the opening of capital. Presents itself. Now, what is he saying here? On the surface of capitalism, you see this glittering wheel of circulation. People are buying and selling, and things are going back and forth, and this seems to be the essence of capitalism, that it is about exchange. It's about money. It's about things, about commodities. Indeed, this is how neoclassical theory starts. Neoclassical theory does say that the essence of capitalism is exchange. That's why in every neoclassical textbook you start off with the first moment in capitalism, which is exchange. Two people meet, they exchange goods, and they go away happy. In real practice, of course, that isn't how exchange ever started. Tribes would meet, and if one tribe could kill off the other and take their goods, they would be happy. So exchange was a very dangerous affair. In fact, early exchanges, there's a form of early exchange called silent exchange, which I think I mentioned last time, but I can't remember. Where a tribe goes into a clearing, leaves some goods, runs back into or goes back to the other people hiding with arrows and bows pointed, just in case they're going to be attacked. And then the other tribe comes and leaves some goods next to it, which is in effect the offer, the counter offer. And if they agree, then you take the goods offered and you keep yours. But if you don't agree, you take some of yours away, saying, no, if you're going to give me that, I'm not going to give you this much. And if this process does not degenerate into war, as many exchanges do, then you have a silent exchange, because at no point do they actually meet. This is actually fairly common. There's a wonderful book. I mentioned it last time. I really recommend it. I would recommend you take it out from the library, but I forgot to return it. But I will. Called Primitive Money by Alison Quiggins. And not only, she's an anthropologist at Cambridge, was an anthropologist at Cambridge. Not only is it a wonderful history of how money arises, it has great pictures, really fabulous color plates of what money is. And we're going to come back to this, because money plays a big role in the argument in Marx. So Marx knows all this because he's, like Smith and Ricardo, has written about money and has studied the origin of money. And if you read the Contribution to a Critique, there's a whole discussion about the origin of money. But here, he's going to stop. He's not going to do it that way. He's going to start a different way. And he's going to say, well, when you look at capitalism, you see this glittering surface, literally glittering surface of commodities. And now he's going to deconstruct that surface. That surface is not the fundamental set of relations. They lie underneath that surface. So how do you get underneath the surface? He says, well, it is this mass of commodities, so let me ask, what is a commodity? We take it for granted, and he's going to show you by unraveling the commodity, the kind of genetic structure of exchange, and then from there, the crucial question, the genetic structure of profit. So Marx says a commodity is a doublet. Now that sounds very sophisticated and very philosophical, but it's not that much of an invention, because actually Smith and Ricardo had already said the same thing. He says it has two characteristics: use value, and if you're going to do this on a page, leave space, because I need a whole other column there for exchange value. So in that sense, this starting point is familiar. It's a doublet. An exchange value, a use value, and an exchange value. And as a use value, it's an object of social use. Whereas as an exchange value, it is an object of social exchange. Now, I put the word social in there because I want to get away from the idea that use value and exchange value are private. They're not. To anticipate in the reading list, you might go ahead. I think it's either this section, I didn't bring the reading list with me, but the article by Steve Heimer called Robinson Crusoe and the Secret of Primitive Accumulation. An absolutely brilliant article. My predecessor actually here, because I joined here just when he was on leave, and he was unfortunately killed in a car crash, and I ended up filling in that position. It's a brilliant article by Steve Heimer about what you mean by the term Robinson Crusoe, who Robinson Crusoe really was, the social content of it. I won't go on more on that, but it's, when you read it, you will see, if you haven't already, you don't already know it, you see what it means to talk about the social content of a category that we take for granted, this person on an island who is doing things for himself and creating the future consumption and all that. It's all nonsense. First of all, we never read the damn book because it's big and you don't remember it and all of that. But he does an absolutely fantastic analysis of it. Reminds us what's in the book, which we forget about.
Is Robinson Crusoe a real person, by the way?
No, but the point is that the character Robinson Crusoe, which we think of in economics as this paradigmatic character, is in the book a slave trader.
Right.
That's what he really is. He's a slave trader whose job it is to forcibly capture people and bring them to Brazil where he's making his money. And then he's on his way back with a second load and his ship gets sunk. And Heimer's point is that when he's on the island, he's already fully constituted member of a society. His brain and his utility function and all that is being built in by the social structure. He's not the top, he's not the eldest son, so therefore he has to actually make a living, though he comes from a well-off family, but he doesn't inherit because the eldest son gets everything, so he has to become what a landed gentleman with no money has to do, which is to trade other people. Now we forget that because we remember only the Disney version. And the real book is something worth reading, but nothing, in my opinion, is a better introduction to the topic of social relations and the portrayal of an individual as trader and all of that is to look at the actual book itself. And it's, many other virtues in the book, but let me leave that here. So let's now follow this line and go down this side first, because the object of social use is an older category, so to speak, or more general category than object of social exchange. As Smith tells us, you can't exchange something unless someone else, some set of people, do it, because exchange is never just occasional. It's a social process. It requires a social use for it. So exchangeable goods have to have a social use, but goods with social use don't have to have exchange. There are many domains in life in which we don't exchange. We don't exchange usually in the household. We don't exchange among friends. We give gifts. That's not the same thing. If I give you a gift and you give me a gift, that's not the same as trading those things. So the term exchange here means trading. And trading carries with it certain content, which we're going to come back to in a minute. So what is the object of social use? This is a material thing. These are actually Marx's words. Or effect. And I'm going to emphasize here some of whose properties satisfy human wants. If my handwriting appears obscure, which it usually does, just ask me. That's why I say it out also. Okay, everybody with me here? So now let me elaborate on this idea of the sum. What do I mean by sum of properties? Suppose I take an object, for the moment a physical object. Let's say a grape. As a physical object, it has a list of properties. Some of these properties are, let's say, physical attributes. And these are the ones here. But only some of them are socially useful, i.e. enter into its use value. And that's pretty obvious, the sugar content, if you like sweet grapes, or at least the taste and the color and the fragrance and all of that. Those are the attributes. There are many other attributes about grapes that we don't care about because they're physical attributes of grapes that are not relevant to our tasting them. Unfortunately, some of them can be dangerous to us if you don't know that the grapes have some poisonous component or toxins on them, or been sprayed with weed killer that'll make sure that no weeds will grow on the grapes, and therefore they will grow inside your stomach. That's another story. You can't tell necessarily, all right? So some of these attributes let's say, are physical attributes, but they're also, another set is not relevant at all, but there are other attributes which are, let me just use a different symbol for them, which are social attributes. Now, what does that mean, social attributes of grapes? I mean, grapes are not social beings, so what does that mean, social attributes of grapes? For a long time, I didn't eat grapes for a particular reason. For a long time, I didn't eat grapes for a particular reason. First from South Africa and then from Chile. You can see the reason, right? And that's because these grapes, however delicious they were, had social attributes which were repugnant to me. And so forth, I didn't eat grapes. And Marx's point is that a use value is not just its physical attributes, but its social content, its social history. We need to know not only how it got there, but how it's made and how much blood it has got on it. So that's the first point. Only some of these properties satisfy human wants, but some of these other properties have relevance for us about whether they become a use value or not. And everybody has in some domain. I remember after the French refused to join, I think it was that moment when they refused to join in the Iraq War, there were people who took French wines and poured them down the toilet. In fact, there was one in New Jersey, according to the New York Times, a man who had a stock of very good French wines, poured them down the toilet because they now signified something to him that obviously the wines hadn't changed in character, and I would have been happy to take them off his hands, but he poured them down the toilet because they were now repugnant to him. And we all have that. Everybody has that attachment. And the other side of it, of course, we also have attachments that are constructed from advertising, that are attachments to the object that make it socially useful or valuable to us, though they are no physical attributes whatsoever. So use value is a social use value. Second point, use values are not just physical goods. Remember I said that in Smith, he falls at one moment into two different types of definitions of use value. One is that it is something physical, productive labor. Remember, he's talking about labor that produces physical goods. And then other time he says it's labor that produces value, exchangeable value. So that raises the question, what happens to services? In Marx, though it's not fully clear because there was a section on unproductive labor which was taken out of Volume 1 of Capital, though it's inserted into some editions. It's called the Resultat, which is a summary. And in there he discusses productive, unproductive labor. So it depends on which version you have. But to just jump ahead, we talked about this before, it could be argued that by use value, an object of social use encompasses goods, what we call goods and services, but not all services. Because the question is whether the service is an object of human want or it's performing some other function. So let me give you an example. One could argue that a car is a use value, right? It's used for whatever purposes in transportation, in business, in personal use, and it's a physical object, so it's a sort of classic example of a so-called good. But a haircut is also a physical set of properties and satisfy human wants, but it's a service as we normally define it because it's a transformation of the shape of your hair. Obviously, I don't do it too often, as you can tell, but it's a commodity, a use value. But so is a concert. A concert is an object of human want, clearly, music, poetry, literature, and yet, at least in a concert, it's not a use value. Marx actually mentioned something about the concert is so material that it depends, of course, on vibrations in the air and all that. There are no concerts in outer space for a very simple reason. And so it also has a material basis, but it's a service. So if that's the case, if use values include physical goods and services, then is not every service a use value? And the answer is no, when we talked about that last time. You can have services involving transfer of goods from one person to another. For instance, if you go to a concert, there's a production crew, produces the concert. and musicians know who that is. And then there's a group of people who take your money as you go in and out. And everybody understands they don't make the concert, but they make it in another sense, because without the money, there'll be no concert in a capitalist society anyway. So they are the transfer of the access to the concert in return for money. They're the wholesale retail sector, the trading sector. But there are also a bunch of people who are guards in a concert, and their job is to maintain security and maintain those social relations that don't allow you to go into a concert by sneaking in or just walking in without paying. So they're not just maintaining peace, they're maintaining the social order. And the term social order means the relations of production and all of the things that go with that, the access relations and so on. Is that point clear? So there's no necessity to confuse the concept of use value with physical goods. It follows then, and this is an extension which Marx doesn't make in volume 1, though there are other parts where he discusses this. It follows then that productive labor or production labor is in the first instance produces a use value. It can be a good or service. But there can be non-production labor that does trading activities, that guarding activities, administrative activities, so on. So this allows us to complete a kind of opening that Adam Smith provides and Ricardo provides. This is the question of production, non-production labor. Now, I won't elaborate on that here, though, because I've got other things I can do with this time. But if you want to follow up on this concrete issue, I have a book called Measuring the Wealth of Nations with my co-author Ahmet Tonak from Turkey. And that book describes these categories, and that section of that description is on my homepage under Measuring the Wealth of Nations. But the more important point is that the distinction between production and non-production labor has implications for how you measure GDP, the wealth of the nation, and so on. Okay? And particularly the treatment of militaries and administrative apparatus and all that, which plays such a huge role in modern society, especially in the developing world. Okay, so from the point of view of production of use value, the corresponding labor is concrete labor. Because this is another duality that appears in Marx, concrete abstract labor. So here you have use value. The qualities of labor that are relevant for the production of use value is what Marx calls concrete labor. And even concrete labor is then he splits into two types, which is particular labor. When viewed from the point of view whether you make grapes or you make steel, that's a particularity of labor. But there's also the generality of labor, which is that labor representing the social whole can be moved from one form to another. A person can learn to make grapes or switch to steel because there is a commonality in the fact that they're both capable of performing labor, and the particularity of it is, so to speak, more local. Everybody see that? I mean, we normally talk about this. We talk about the working class or labor, we mean the generality. We talk about a particular form of labor, a particular activity, we're referring on to the other side. But these are clearly real differences. They're not just levels of abstraction. They're senses in which people operate at this level and another sense in which they exist and operate at another level. Okay. Now, I should have said concrete labor here, sorry. Product of concrete labor. And another a point here, let me just finish this, is that there's nothing in here to say that the division of labor does not require or originate in exchange. You recall in Adam Smith, he argues that the division of labor comes out of the natural propensity to truck and barter, and that therefore human societies develops a division of labor as it develops the extent of the market. But in fact, Marx certainly rejects that, and there's really a considerable anthropological evidence, historical evidence, that many aspects of society have a division of labor which do not require or do not depend on exchange. An army is a division of labor, but they don't usually allow you to say to the captain or major, I don't think I'm going to do this unless you give me something in return. You know, you get shot That's called, that's something illegal in the Army, actually. And you literally can get shot at certain times of that. There are times when the exchange process may operate, but usually in these kinds of structures, and indeed there are villages and tribal relations in which the division of labor takes place. The household is an example where it's a very basic example, basic meaning it's fundamental to all societies, in which the division of labor is not based on exchange. So the idea that exchange is the root of the division of labor, which is Smith's idea and often picked up in neoclassical theory, is a fiction, historical fiction. And it's not, therefore, you don't seek, therefore, this natural propensity to truck and barter as the root of human development. Again, these points may be obvious to anybody who's studied anthropology, but it's important because they are points that Marx is making against conventional wisdom. In fact, Marx makes a different point about the division of labor, which is that the division of labor is central to social reproduction. That every form of society is built on a certain division of labor, and that doesn't mean it's good. But that division of labor performs a function which is relevant to the reproduction of a society. So, an example I frequently give, imagine a starship. A starship now, at least as we visualize it in our fictional accounts, is like a battleship, which is very big also, but bigger, because in a starship, you have to have the means to reproduce the whole society within the ship. Right? You have to grow your own food because you're going long distances. You have to have the water and reproduce and conserve it and all that. So it's a kind of mini Earth. It's very interesting that when we talk about starships, we almost never refer to them as mini markets. There may be some people who trade and exchange in science fiction, but most of them are presented as following orders and doing a division of labor, which is a strictly determined hierarchy in order for that social system in this metal casing to survive. So we must not confuse the division of labor with exchange. It is certainly true that exchange promotes a certain kind of division of labor, but it doesn't originate the division of labor. And obviously, therefore, exchange also eliminates or curtails other divisions of labor. Just as it promotes some, it inhibits others. And this is a point we're going to come back to again, which is the negative properties of exchange. It's not just all positive. Okay, so that then leads me to the question of exchange. Any questions up to here? Yeah.
Does the generality of concrete labor
I haven't come to value yet. So far, we're only talking about use value. But you can certainly say, it's meaningful to say that a society has to do something with its labor as general labor, right? It's how it decides to locate that labor. I don't want to say allocate. I don't like that word because it suggests that somebody's either doing it or it's some kind of efficiency thing. But how the division of labor is undertaken is a social issue. It's not necessarily a person that does it, but it's a social issue. Let me give the other example, which is obvious. The caste system in India. For a long time functioned as a major source of the division of labor. But it's not a division of labor in which you can choose what you can do. You're born into it, and you have to maintain it. But that whole system is reproducing only because that division of labor is there. There are other divisions of labor that can reproduce another system, but that division of labor produces that system. A slave system is another example of a division of labor for obvious characteristics, but that slave system cannot survive without that division of labor. It is then no longer a slave system, and the relationships that rest on that crumble. A feudal system is a division of labor. And it's not one based on the market. It's based on force and class and inequality of power. Okay? I bring this up because this is really the background in Marx. It's obvious to Marx, so to speak, but it gets lost if we don't pay attention to it. Yes, I'm sorry.
Can you repeat what kind of services accounts for these use values?
I'm sorry? I gave examples. So here, it's services which are objects of direct use, like haircuts and concerts, or satisfy human wants. Services that involve taking services, let's say, and transferring the right to them are clearly distinct because they serve to transfer wealth from one form to another. Now, some people want this, but the point is they don't want it for the service itself. They want it for the access to the money or the access to the service. There's a joint thing, but it's different from consuming a concert and trying to get into a concert. As anyone who's tried to sneak into a concert knows, concert is just even better if you didn't pay for it. But the fact is that you have to pay for it, usually. So that's a distinction, and same thing for the guards. The guards are performing a service which is necessary, but it's not the same thing as the object that they are preventing you from getting into or preventing you from disrupting. Okay? And have many more discussions of this in the book, so we go through quite a list of these things here. And by the way, I should say that there's never any such thing as an exact dividing line in anything. There's the clearly different centers of gravity, but then as concrete examples come, there's a penumbra where they overlap, and it's not easy to draw that line. But that does not falsify the fact that there's a difference of category here. If you go into most stores today, there are people whose job it is to follow you around and make sure that you're not leaving with some of the merchandise. And every store owner understands that they're not the people they would like to have if they didn't need that prevention mechanism, because they're a way of preventing the diminution of the merchandise, but they're not essential to the act of selling or acquiring the merchandise, which is a different activity. Okay. All right, any other questions? So let's go on to this mysterious thing about exchange value. And the first point that Marx wants to make is that this arises under particular circumstances. One form of exchange, which I mentioned in passing before, is called silent exchange, in which case exchange takes place on the edges of the group. It's not within the group, it's between groups, and it takes place in a very cautious manner because of the risk that if you go there to exchange, they may jump on you and take away what you've got. This is a problem in all exchange, by the way. There's no guarantee that they won't just take what they have. So exchange always has this possibility that it won't be by the rules that you would like or the amounts that you like. And this is exchange on the margins of society. So Adam Smith is right to say that exchange enhances the division of labor, that we put it correctly, because if a tribe begins to produce more of something that it can trade with another tribe, because it can get something else from that tribe, then it's specializing in the exchangeable object and not so much in the one that they couldn't get easily, or perhaps at all. And so there's a kind of twisting of the division of labor. It also removes another kind of production that you may not want to do it here because you can get it there more easily. So it's not obvious that it changes the extent of the division of labor, but it certainly changes the focus of it. Is this point clear? That origins of exchange certainly don't require that exchange is done inside. But you can have also exchange internal to a social group. I'm sorry, I did say I meant external. External exchange, in which case it's not just on the margins of society, but built into the structure of it. What we would call foreign trade, but it's not necessarily nations either. It can be between regions, but it becomes regularized. So it now becomes a part of the presumption society. This could be viewed as occasional, and this is regular. Silent exchange is very occasional. Typically, you have to make a trip to an area where there is on the frontier or border of another tribe. You have to take the risk that they will not waylay you and take everything you want, or some other tribe won't, and then you come back with whatever. This has to be worth it, and that kind of exchange is therefore not regular. But regular exchange is when this kind of intercourse between groups goes on in a way that you can start to count on it and become part of the social division of labor. Everybody see the difference in that? So imagine now that instead of the trip out to the forest and hoping to come back at all, let alone come back with something better than you prefer than what you started with as a group, imagine that there's a market, that everybody can come to that market, and there are rules enforced, of course, because trading is antagonistic by its nature. You want everything they've got for nothing, and they want everything you've got for nothing, and so the whole point is you're going to be fighting under various rules about how much you can get in return for something else. And this is a point in Marx that exchange is not simply a benign process, but involves an internal degree of antagonism. It's in the nature of trading that you want to get more for the least you can give, and therefore it has always got this push-pull antagonism. Anybody who's ever bartered knows, or anybody who's gone to any part of the world where you start to bargain, you understand perfectly well. They're going to give you a price that's totally ridiculous, and you have to say, this is completely ridiculous, I'm leaving. And they go, no, have some tea. Sit down, let's talk about how's your family, what's the other price. No, this is totally ridiculous, I'm leaving, I'm a poor man, I don't have any money. You're supposed to do that. But the content of that is that it is a tussle. It's not just, it's a formalized tussle, but the real content is it is a tussle. They're trying to get much more money from you than it's worth. And you're trying to pay for it less than it's worth, whatever that is. And so you have this fight going on all the time. Okay. So then there's a third form of exchange, which is regular internal exchange. There can be also occasional internal exchange, but you get the point. It can be occasional. How do you spell occasional? Is that right? Looks funny. Yeah, occasional. Or regular. Or put it another way, this can be limited to certain spheres, and regular, or it can be general. By regular, it doesn't mean that it's general. General can be, it's extensive. Yes, it could, but I really mean more than, I would say more than occasional. What I really mean here is the general or limited. Because by limited, I mean that imagine a village in which most people live on the land and they produce most things for themselves. The food, the clothing, they do the cleaning, they do the hunting and the dressing of the game and all of that. But they need some things. They can't make their own mirrors, let's say. They may not make their own steel, so that there is a general store in town where you go in with some of the things that you've done, the products that you've gotten, and you exchange them once in a while, or you sell them for money to someone else who does that. I'm trying to avoid the money yet because I want to bring it in. But let's suppose you exchange them and say, look, I'll give you so much of deer meat for some things that I need, like another tool that I'm now missing is broken. That's when, however, you become, that's limited because it only applies to some things. The more that expands, the more your reproduction depends on having to pass through many hands. And then the more you are, therefore, incorporated into a bigger web, and the more you are dependent on the reproduction of that web. Very crucial, obviously. If exchange is general, then each one of us is producing a small part of this whole web of things. And if the web stops, our part also falls apart. Marx makes the point that when you get into exchange, especially general exchange, then you are largely producing not for yourself. That means that you are anticipating two kinds of things. Those who will take what you want to produce and have chosen to produce, and you could be wrong, and they'll say, well, we're not interested, and then you're really screwed. Or they do take what you want, and it turns out that what you expect to do with that money or the goods that you get, you can't get because other people didn't produce what you need to transform it into. Right? So the problem is double-sided. You have something to give, but then you want a multiplicity of other things. So every exchange carries with it this anticipation of a social nexus of people at the other side, and vice versa for them. Every exchange carries with, for them, the idea that you will do your part and someone else will do their part. So exchange then becomes this series of anticipations. Anticipations of production for exchange, and anticipation of exchange values. So the more general it becomes, the more essential it is that, that this anticipation be understood. Now, here's a point that Marx makes about this. He says, look, think about generalized exchange, which is because he's leading towards capitalism, which is a form in which exchange becomes very generalized. The peculiarity of generalized exchange, and hence the peculiarity of capitalism, is that everyone is doing something on this spaceship which we expect will satisfy some other wants. Because, I mean, why are we going to produce a ton of corn? We can't eat that ton by ourselves and couldn't live without the other things. We're doing it because we expect other people want it. But every one of them is producing steel and core and iron and chocolate and milk and liquor and everything on the anticipation that you and everyone else is going to also want that. So that everyone's anticipation incorporates a wide set of others. And the mystery about capitalist reproduction is that it works at all. But everyone is guessing. Every round you're guessing. Any business will tell you, of course you're guessing. And if the market disappears, then you're dead because you've got this product and no one wants it. Or not as many people as you want it, and then you're in trouble. So this division of labor, which exchange presupposes, every one of you is producing thinking you're going to sell it, and then you're thinking you're going to buy with it. That means you're presuming not only that, but the act of buying and selling, but the act of all the others. In your head is a whole society. But each one of you has got a different head and a different society in your head. And the weird part is that for reproduction to take place, these things must mesh. Marx's point is that they don't mesh. What happens is the discrepancies get manifested in exchange. The discrepancy between your individual general notion of the social division of labor and your individual general notion and your individual general notion comes together by the fact that each one of you, based on this general notion, are going to produce something. But when you get to the market, you find out whether your notions are consistent. And generally, of course, they won't be consistent. And because they're not consistent, the market's going to tell you, oh, the price has gone down because, hey, guess what? The market moved away from your product. Too bad. Her product's price has gone up because it turns out they moved towards her. And so she produces more and you produce less. In the next period, it may be reversed. Because all of these are reflections of this general set of inconsistent, or not necessarily consistent, anticipations. I don't like the word expectation because it suggests something different. Anticipation is better because you're acting on it. Right? When you go into an elevator and you open the door, you're anticipating there'll be a floor. Generally speaking, there's a floor, but occasionally there's not. And as you read in the paper, sometimes that causes problems if you step in. So it's the same thing in exchange. Exchange has this miraculous property that you're making a guess about other people's choice, other people's intentions. And you're guessing that it'll keep on going, because if you take something 2 years, you're guessing 2 years ahead. So how does this come together? The classicals say it comes together by being wrong. And the market signals rights and wrongs. Too much in one place, too little in another. Both are wrong. But one is a positive feedback and the other is negative. And every round, when you get that feedback, you change your behavior. But if you change your behavior, other people's behavior will change too as a result of that, because we're interacting. And so this process is one of turbulent overshooting and undershooting. This is Adam Smith's invisible hand. This is Marx's reproduction of the division of labor. But notice something interesting about this. How does neoclassical theory deal with this issue? What do we call that in orthodox economics? This very same question. What do we call it? Pardon? I can't hear you because no, it starts with the word general. What is it called? General equilibrium, right? Why is it called general equilibrium? Because neoclassical theory skips the problem and says, let me assume there is a point where all of these individual anticipations exactly mesh. And we call that general equilibrium. Right? Walras does it another way. He tells the same story of general equilibrium, but he uses another fiction. Every one of you is not actually exchanging. You're simply saying, I think I would like to do this. And the Walrasian auctioneer, who's like the Wizard of Oz, is standing there taking all your bids and saying, no, you do that, then you will not get the price you're thinking. And you go, oh, no, okay, I won't do that. And somehow, these auctioneers will all, or the auctioneer will somehow manage everybody's anticipations and plans and so on before they do anything, and then say to you, and this is the key to Walrasian economics, you're not allowed to exchange until you get the clear signal, which is that if you do that, you'll be able to get the thing that you want at the price you want. And so therefore, when you act, you're already in general equilibrium. But these are obvious devices to remove the problem, which is, of course, that you act before you know that, and how you find out whether you're right or wrong is because you act. So it's very bizarre to me that the idea of harmonious general equilibrium is based on the most vicious dictator of all, who doesn't allow you to even do a thing until you get permission. Saddam Hussein never had this power that the Walrasian auctioneer has, and yet we worship that mathematically. Now, these points are clear because already in Marx's time these ideas were floating. So he's already aiming at this, these set of fictions which come about. Harmonious exchange, general balance and division of labor, which is coherent and all of that. And here exchange plays a very important role, therefore, in Marx. It's the sphere in which the contradictions in the division of labor become visible, use his term, visible, become apparent. And therefore, this sphere is not the smooth wheel circulating, it's a bubbling surface all the time of things blowing up and things breaking down, and that's exactly how the process of balance takes place. By errors on offsetting errors, one too high, one too low. And I made this point from the beginning, and you see now its relevance in the description of social reproduction. That's precisely why in a spaceship, by the way, they don't let you do it that way. You can't be running around and saying, well, I won't do this today, I don't feel like working today, and stuff like that. They have very severe penalties if you choose not to do your assigned work. Okay? Is this point clear? The next time you're told about general equilibrium, try to remember this part and use it. So from here, Marx doesn't dwell so much on this at this part, though he does elsewhere, but he chooses to focus on a different aspect, which is what does exchange do? What is the process of exchange? And being a philosopher, and of course, coming from a tradition of looking deeper, he asks us to consider that what exchange does is compare things which are not alike. That seems like a trivial problem, but of course you don't exchange one piece of cake for an identical piece of cake, because that makes no sense, unless it's some kind of ritual of honoring, you give them the cake and then they give you the cake and everybody feels good, but that's not, we understand that's not an exchange. That's a formality, a form of social interaction. Exchange comes when you have a piece of cake and they have something else that you want, and you haggle over how little cake you can give them and how much you can get of the coffee in return. That's exchange. So Marx says, when in this exchange, notice what you're doing. You're comparing two things which are unlike, and you're reducing them to the same abstract quality. And what is that quality? It's exchange value. You're saying, when I decide that these two things are going to be exchanged in these quantities, when you arrive at that, we're saying they both represent the same quantity of exchange value. Right? But that's a social assignment. It's not like saying that these two things weigh the same thing because they have an intrinsically similar mass. They have the same mass. I can do that. I can say in physics, put them on a scale, enough chalk to balance this out and say, aha, I know that this object has the same mass as that object, right? That's a natural property. Marx is saying that we create a social property of assignment of equal quantities of exchange value to commodities through social interaction. Let's call this quantity quantitative worth. I say quantitative because I want to emphasize it's quantity. Yeah.
Marx, K value is strictly not.
We haven't said anything yet about the source of it, about the manner in which it's arrived, because I want to get to that. But the answer is yes, it's subjective in the moment. But for the same reason that Ricardo says that objects of utility which are reproducible are not dependent on your feeling about them, but on the cost, the answer is going to be, in the end, that doesn't play the central role. What plays a role is the structure of production and the cost of that production. Okay, so this step of equalizing two unequal things and making them therefore equally quantities of quantitative worth, of exchange value, Marx is not satisfied with just saying that. He says, but look, these things are products of labor, and they're products of concrete labor. Chalk-making labor is not the same thing as paper-making labor. So what we're doing when we compare two objects and reduce them to an equal quantity, even though we have not specified what that quantity is, how it's expressed, it's an equal, intrinsically equal quantity, we're also reducing their labors to be equivalent quantities. In other words, but what labor then are we reducing? It's not the concrete labor. It's not the labor related to the concrete properties, because those are exactly what we're abstracting from. When you say these things are equal in exchange, I don't mean because they taste the same or because they look the same. On the contrary, I only trade them because they're not the same. So exchange is a process of abstracting from their concrete character, making them qualitatively similar in exchange value, and then the same attribute is therefore being attached, so to speak, to the labor that underlies them. So by abstracting from their concrete qualities, we also are abstracting from the concrete labor. In other words, we're creating what he calls abstract labor in this moment. And this is not we in the sense that we subjectively do this. It is we in the sense that the social process does it. There's no king of exchange. There's no Wizard of Oz to tell you what this exchange value is. It's a process. But this process is definitely comparing the labors behind that. And therefore, it ends up regulating the social division of labor through this comparison. And that's the point where I started before. How does it get to be socially divided? Through the exchange process in which these labors are compared to each other, but not in terms of their use value. Not like in the caste system where the labors are compared in terms of their use value. You have to do this or that. Not in terms of the spaceship and your tasks, but in terms of their exchange value. So the social division of labor gets, on one hand, feedback from exchange value. On the other hand, exchange value is the mechanism of showing you the discrepancies in the social division of labor, because that changes the price up or down. So it's a turbulent, bubbling surface all the time. So Marx makes the following point then from this. In a society in which exchange value determines the division or regulates the division of labor, regulates feedbacks, then human labor, the labors that go into that, become social only under what he calls objectified husk, only when their product becomes valorized. The term valorized means converted into something with value, right? So the strange thing about the division of labor in a exchange process or a society dominated by exchange is that the socialness of the labor becomes evident indirectly through the valorization of the commodities. Now that sounds mysterious, but it isn't really. Your labor gets judged by the worth of your product. Now that's a different mode of judgment, right? I can say that, look, I make wonderful, clean, pollution-free bread, and nobody wants it. What we want is chickens with lots of chemicals in them that are cheaper, and so the labor going to making dangerous and possibly harmful chickens is valorized and is socially worth more than the labor of making something that people don't want or don't accept in the same degree, even though we might on other criteria say it's much better. So this is a process of attaching social worth to labor exchange or reproduction through exchange.
Why is Marx's dissent different from dissent because of labor theory value?
Well, we haven't come to the labor theory value yet, so save that question. But at the moment, we've got labor which is now abstracted, not in the moment of exchange, but because it's participating in a regular exchange process. It's labor now that's acquired this quality. You're judging the labor not by whether you're good at doing things, not whether you're safe at doing things, you take great care, but how much the product of your labor will be worth in the market. And this is an important point. Those two are contradictory. If you ever worked, you can know that someone who does careful, good work can get fired because they don't produce enough shoddy goods which will make more money, right? So it's a different criterion of valuation of the labor. If you go on a call center, you start talking to someone there, you can't talk to them too long. They can't be too friendly. You can be miserable and lonely and all that. They can't because it's the computer watching them and the computer's timing them. And the timing is how fast they turn over, not whether they make you feel good. They need to make you feel good enough to buy the product, but the rest of that, you want to commit suicide, please do it offline because I have to move on. And that discrepancy comes from the incentive structure. It's a different valuation of labor. Okay? So, there is another point in that, is that the labor that counts, I'm sorry, yes? Indeed, and so the object there is to get the most out of the customer in terms of the product. But let me pose a different thing. What if you're a worker which put a poison in a product in order to make it cheaper? You'd be valued for that as long as you didn't get caught. But we have all these concerns about products coming in with all kinds of dangerous things in them. It's not because people are bad. They understand that it lowers the cost, increases the productivity, and if they can get away with it, that's fine. Tobacco has been doing it for a really long time, and only lately any negative feedback, and it doesn't really touch it. And it's not because of the people doing it. If they do the wrong thing, they get punished for it. If they do the right thing, they get rewarded for it. And that right thing is not measured by the quality of the product or the niceness of their behavior, but by the outcome in terms of exchange value and more generally in terms of profitability. That's the point. So you set up a contradiction between those attributes. Sometimes they go in the same direction, but other times they pull in another direction. So notice it's not the use value, it's the exchange value. In exchange value, you can make money by having a use value which is fictitious. I mean, everybody knows you can buy something that you can go down to many parts of New York City and buy a Rolex for $50. It's not a Rolex, but the fact is that it could look like a Rolex, and maybe it'll run for a week, and maybe you'll fall for that or not. I read recently about one of them, I think it was the obituary or retrospective on the man who made money by selling the Brooklyn Bridge many times over. He got caught in the end, but he did pretty well for a while. And people do this all the time, all the time. So that's a discrepancy. It's the exchange value that becomes dominant. Okay. So the last point. So now we have abstract labor here behind exchange. But abstract labor in Marx is not labor which becomes abstracted in the moment of exchange, but becomes abstract labor because it is aimed at exchange. This is it seems like a trivial point, but it's very important. In Marx, he attaches the term labor, of value rather, to abstract labor, the quantity of abstract labor. Not the individual labor that you did, or he did, or she did, but the average for the commodity. That's what he calls socially necessary abstract labor time. So I can say that there's a certain number of hours that goes into the production of this paper, and that's its direct and indirect socially necessary abstract labor time. Socially necessary because it's the average, abstract because it's involved in production of this as a commodity. If I want to sit at home in my evenings and make paper, that's not affecting anything because it doesn't enter the market. In any way, its value would not be my labor, but the average labor that the market supports in that. So that's the source of the idea of labor value as abstract socially necessary labor. But Marx is careful to say that it does not follow that labor value regulates price in every circumstance. It regulates price only where it becomes the essential activity of labor to produce a commodity. What does that mean? Consider the original issue of occasional exchange. Two tribes creeping around the forest hoping that they don't get killed, and they come to this opening and they leave something here, and the other leaves something, and then they take back something, and they sort of bargain in there. Now, what determines that bargain? Well, if they do this occasionally and for occasional products, there's no reason that should be related to the labor that it takes to get those goods. Those goods may be ceremonial goods. They may have some religious significance. They may have significance to the society independent of the labor time that it took to make that. So there, you have exchange, but it's not regulated by value. Because the cost of production of the exchange doesn't become relevant unless the exchange becomes a regular activity. Unless a product is produced for exchange, in which case, on a regular basis, so that it becomes a central activity of the producer, then the costs become. So value, so to speak, becomes a regulator of price only insofar as the products are being produced primarily and increasingly as commodities. Again, this is not a mysterious thing. If you happen to make in your house wine for the fun of it, and then you sell it outside, whatever you get for it will not be dependent on the labor that you put into it. And if you do it occasionally, you may not even care what you get for it, because that depends on how you feel about that extra thing. If, however, you go into a winery and you are working for an owner of a winery, then in fact the cost becomes very central to the sale of the wine or the sale of any other product. Okay? All right. From this point of view, we come back to the original issue of exchange as the creation of the quantitative, equal quantities of quantitative worth. When I exchange two products, I say, okay, these are equivalent. But equivalent, how is that equivalent expressed? In the simplest form, the equivalence is expressed by saying, this is equivalent to this. Well, then I can say that this is equivalent to this. And I can keep on going down that list so I can create a chain of equivalences. This is the whole discussion marks about forms of value. The elementary form is a relationship between two objects. As the sphere of exchange widens, every object related to any other object is related to others because that object may be used to trade. So you can see quickly that you have a whole series of equivalence relationships. Is that point clear? No? Some of you look puzzled. You're not obviously traders, but did I do it again? Okay, so suppose that I have commodity A related to commodity B in exchange. And I say that these are now equivalent in the sense that these are the quantities that I trade, right? So they have equal, by implication, they have equal exchangeable value. But when I say, what is that exchangeable value? You say, well, corn is equal to so much steel. And what's the exchangeable value of steel? It's corn. Now, as I expand that circle, let's say this is corn, and this is steel. But steel can be traded for cloth. So now I have not only steel traded for cloth and viewed as equivalent, but corn is now equivalent to cloth because of the fact that steel is equivalent to cloth in a certain quantity. Therefore, a certain quantity of corn is equivalent to cloth in a certain quantity. You can see that relation can be expanded. So that's a general equivalence because the further exchange spreads, the more you have an implicit or explicit relationship between one thing and another in the social process of assignment of exchange value. We haven't yet talked about this long-term determinant. Marx is just not concerned with that yet. He's concerned with the fact that we've assigned a common unit. And he's aiming somewhere else. As you continue to do this, you can see that every commodity is in, suppose you go into a market with 100 commodities. How many possible combinations are there of these exchange relations? Well, there are a lot, obviously. This is a factorial problem, in case you don't remember. But anyway, there are a lot. Because every commodity can be related to 99 others, but each of the 99 can be related to the rest of the 99. You can see you have a whole lot of combinations. And that's not a problem for philosophers. It's actually a practical problem when you go into a market. You have to keep track of these exchange relations. So it's not surprising that with the existence of generalized exchange comes the obvious point that instead of all of these being related to each other, you end up with saying exchange A is related to something called G, and product A and product B and product C, and let's call this XG, because some set of products are used by more people or more desired by people, and a social process is more socially desirable more often, and it becomes natural to say, I compare my product with this, and you compare your product with this, and then we only have, every one of us, a pair. Everybody understand that? This actually happens, and that's a nice thing about the Quiggins book. She traces the development of this with many, many different products. What's this product? Well, it could be flying fox jaws. It could be hides in Russia. It could be tobacco. It could be salt. It could be cowrie shells. If you grew up in India at a certain age, certainly in my age, when I was very young, I remember being taken to the market and my mother giving money for something, and if there wasn't a small enough denomination, you give it in rupees and annas, and if it wasn't small enough from there, they gave you the rest in shells. But the shells counted for small quantities of money. But cowrie shells actually traded across the whole world and were a form of money because A, they're not destructible, and B, they cannot be counterfeit. You can fake gold, but you can't fake a cowrie shell until recently, modern plastics and all of that, because it's a shell, and people could tell whether it was real or not. So it was a perfect money. It's durable, it's light, it's not reproducible, and therefore it could act as a commodity which everybody else could refer to. Now, that's Marx's point. The origin of money is the self-selection out of the world of commodities of a set of more generally useful or valued commodities, and those appear as money because you convert the exchange value of everything into a quantity of the other thing. So what develops now is the idea of price. What is price? Well, you go in there and you say, this is 6 cowrie shells. That's its price. And I come in here and say, well, this is also 3 cowrie shells. Okay, so then I get for this, I get 2 pieces of chalk. That conversion is implicit because I reduce everything to cowrie shells or hides or salt or whatever. So the mystery of money is that it is a social assignment. We haven't yet talked about the determinants of the social assignment, but it's a social assignment of quantitative worth expressed in the body of something. Well, of course, if I say 2 things are equal, I cannot say what they're equal to because they're equal to each other, and I need something else if I want to represent both of them outside of themselves. But that something is just another thing, another commodity, chosen by society at some moment in history, and different societies choose different commodities. Cows are a common one, for instance, or cattle, or so on. So the mystery of money is that it's not mysterious. Now, at some point, and I'm skipping a lot of ground here, but at some point, if I have a commodity, let's call it cowrie shells, because I don't want to call it gold, what the G stands for, right? Because the gold comes very late in the story. Then I can say, look, this is 6 cowrie shells. And the person says, okay, I'll give you a piece of paper with 6 cowrie shells. If you really want cowrie shells, you can go over there to my storehouse and take it. But you can take this paper and go over there and get chalk with it, give it to this person and say, this paper is worth 6 cowrie shells because I have an institutional structure that allows me to back that up because someone got real cowrie shells back there. So I go and I use the paper, and this person takes it, gives me chalk, and the person now has the paper, has a cowrie shells, and it moves on to food and so on, and the cowrie shells circulate in the opposite direction from commodities, right? Commodities goes one way, money goes the other way. But that is an assignment of faith. Because once you start substituting for the actual commodity a piece of paper or a promise, then you have not only the faith that the cowrie shell is going to be accepted by anyone, which is already a faith, but you have a second derivative, which is the faith that the paper will be convertible if anything happens. That's why goldsmiths started. I mean, there's a positive advantage to it. If you lose a paper, you can get another one. But if you lose the cowrie shells, you lose the cowrie shells. So trade becomes dependent, and exchange becomes dependent on symbols of money, symbolic money. And that's the origin of paper money, and credit is the same. The old goldsmiths would take your money, and they'd say to you, you can get it back anytime you want, and here's a piece of paper saying that you have this money. Well, you don't have to go to the goldsmith to use your money to buy a house. You go to the person in the house, and you say, I sign my name to this paper saying I assign you this much of my money that the goldsmith has, and give me your house. And if they know the goldsmith and they trust the bank, in effect, they take that money, that bank money. That's how it starts. But that's another layer of exchange, of faith. Now you're not just faith in having the money, you have a faith in the banker. So the history of money can be developed from that point of view until the creation of modern fiat money. Fiat money meaning where it's no longer backed by official guarantee. And I'm going to end on this point here. That's not what I intended to, but anyway, while we're at it, the fact that it's not backed by official guarantee doesn't mean that it's not backed. And that's a big illusion that people have, which, again, a point very obvious in Marx because paper money was invented and used widely where? Where was paper money invented and used widely? First. China, yeah, probably, but the part that was known to Marx, everything was done first in China, probably. But the one which was widely knowledgeable to the Europeans was the American colonists. American colonists came here. They were part of an empire that didn't want them to have independence, so they didn't have gold, but they wanted to create a state and an army and other activities, and so what they would do is they hand out pieces of paper that say, these paper will be validated in gold a few years from now when we sort of get our act together. So in the meantime, give me your munitions, give me your cows, and so on. And insofar as that was persuasive, they were able to do that and keep that going because the next person taking that piece of paper had to have that faith too. In point of fact, they never paid it off. What they did is they paid off by printing more paper. So the first people to invent fiat money, at least in this part of the world, also the first ones to invent hyperinflation. Prices went to such a point where things would have cost $3 before, were now costing $10,000, and the currency called the continental became worthless. And today there's a phrase when you say something is worthless, you say it's not worth a continental. It comes from that history of the invention of fiat money and hyperinflation. So there's the other side of this. The faith can have consequences that are unintended. The whole history of money and banking is a struggle between the argument that it's all faith and the argument that you shouldn't have too much faith. because the other side is in a buildup of debt and all the consequences of all of that. So I won't have time to pursue this, though it's a wonderful, interesting topic. You can take a look at some books. In addition to the Quiggins book, you might take a look at a book by John Kenneth Galbraith. This, by the way, is not Jamie Galbraith, who's his son, but John Kenneth Galbraith, who was the American ambassador, among other things, to India, and a confidant of many people in government and of the Kennedys and all of that. Very civilized, witty, urbane man, and this is a really charming book, and it's called Money: Whence It Came and Where It Went, or something like that. And you can buy it in the Strand, probably, or on Amazon. It's really worth reading. It's a wonderful read. Okay, I have 5 minutes, right? We hit the limit, right? Is it 7:40 or 7:50? We have 10 minutes. So I want to bring the last point, which is it was my ending point and it relates to what we started with, which is the development of exchange is the development of the fetishism of commodities. Because once social labor is mediated by exchange, and in fact social labor is conducted for the purpose of exchange, then humans relate to each other and to their labors and to the reproduction of society not through the use values, but through exchange values, and indeed through things which are exchangeable. And these things, because they're exchangeable, appear to have a native property of being exchangeable. So we say, oh, gold is, well, it's clearly a wonderful thing because it's so valuable. We forget that value or that worth is assigned by a social process and it becomes a property of gold itself. And of course, in a different society, we say, well, obviously, flying fox jaws are absolutely fabulous because they're so valuable. Or tobacco, or salt. It gets imbued in the commodity because the mysterious process underneath gets lost and it becomes a thing of it. So then the crucial point is that then people relate, the laborers relate in society not through the direct relation but mediated by things. And these things become seemingly the central object of human relations. People no longer are not viewed as a central, labor is not used as a central object, and doesn't mean it's good or bad, by the way. In the caste society, labor is a central object, but it's mediated by caste, but that they relate to each other through things. Now, this Marx calls the fetishism of commodities. The displacement of social relations into and through things. It's a real relation. It's not just an imaginary one. We are actually related to each other in exchange through things. But of course, that makes the things look like they are the source of the value, and we are sort of just the adapters to it. And that's a displacement of the real relation. Now notice that this, he says, is a relationship in which it becomes a relationship through things, and then things become, so to speak, the real power, and people become just the carriers of those things. So it's a typical inversion. So what is this nasty relation? What does this say? Okay, so utility function. And what is x1, x2, x3? Commodities, right? Things. But more specifically, exchange values, because we know they're going to be a P1, P2, P3 attached to these, right? So here we have the perfect model of the fetishism of commodity, commodity fetishism. Each individual I, has a utility function or derive their social satisfaction, their personal satisfaction from things and only things. No person enters in your utility function. Your mother's not there. Your children are not there. Your siblings are not there. Your president is not there. It's only things. And therefore, we interact with each other in the market, not directly, but through our thing relationship. We interact through the demand and supply to these things. This is the absolutely perfect reduction that Marx is talking about, a reduction in which social relations get transposed onto a relation of people through things. And yet this is the essence of orthodox economics. Orthodox economics develops essentially an utterly fetishized view of human behavior. And by the way, it's not just about buying commodities and all that. Becker develops it, as you know, into a theory of family, theory of marriage, and many other people have extended it to all kinds of social relations. If Marx could spring up from the grave, he would say, I told you. This was fetishism in the extreme. Okay? So we will begin next time some of the further implications of this, and I want to, I think I've lost track of where I am, but I might do a little bit more on money, but I think I want to move on to value in its relation to price. Come back to Ricardo's problem.
Am I supposed to be hearing audio, Ann?
We can't hear anything at the moment.
Right.
There we go. You should hear something now. Yes?
Yes.
I didn't have any problems online. Anyway. So to recapitulate, we're on, today was episode 7 of Anwar Sheikh talking, and I've included a few things on today's page that will probably carry over for a couple of days, introducing the question of value form, or form and value, against which the background is being developed by Sheikh on the basic issues of use and exchange value. But we haven't really gotten to the big V value, or the value form issue. And I've put in a few things, like this is the basic description of value form, and this is the paragraph from which value form emerges, or the people who believe in a value form theory. This is Marx, the particular paragraph where we get value form from. And I've included an article by John Milius, and you may have heard a little bit of it before, but this is, I have the at least the link to the complete article on the value form question. And there are, of course, stuff on YouTube that describe this, and maybe it isn't as clear, but you can see that in this article, we're doing essentially the same thing that Sheikh is doing, slightly different perspective, but this is actually the same issue. And one should not see them as discrete in that particular sense. This is still the discussion of what Sheikh is talking about from a slightly different thing. And but it's there, and it's worth considering, because that's sort of what Sheikh is talking about as well. Anwar Sheikh is talking about in the video. So I've included the first couple pages of that article, and then I've included also a review of Sheikh's magnum opus, the one that he talks about at the beginning of the audio tape, of the videotape. This is a review of Capitalism, Competition, Conflict, and Crisis, the 4 C's, by Sheikh, that was published by Oxford, as he says. This is a review of the book by Heikki Patomäki, a Finn, and it's a quick review and doesn't quite cover what you might probably want from this, and it is a critique of it in the sense of being a review. Problematic for its own reasons. The problem of reading reviews is often you never really quite get what it's not a précis of the book, and yet it's also a kind of review or critique of the book. But reviews are never critiques if you really want to think about it in the big picture. So anyway, without going at great length about it, but he does ask some of the basic questions that about the book that kind of emerged. The question of whether he integrates Polanyi, and actually he does. He did refer to Polanyi in an earlier lecture, so it's not like he didn't think about it. Although maybe Sheikh just read the review and responded in that sense. And then at the last thing I've included is an article on Marxist crisis theory, but it is actually an overview of this basic problem: the difference between orthodox and heterodox, the difference between classical, neoclassical, and something else, or Keynesianism, for example. And so all of those things are actually in this article, which pretty compact. I actually like this article because it is fairly compact and gives you a good overview of some of the basic issues that exist. This is only a couple of years old, I think, this post article, so it's not too horrible. And this is an important issue that will come up in Sheikh, that Sheikh is conventionally going to get there. So these are some of the general issues about profit, etc., that are currently at work. So I will now come on, stop the live stream. Come on, here we go.